This is reading Wikipedia. It is what it sounds like. I used to own a Game Gear, and then I sold it. I don't regret it from an enjoyability point of view. The screen was dim, colors were washed out, and anything that moved had this ghosting effect. But it was visually appealing and fit in your hands well, so I wish I had it as a prop. But I kept all the boxes my games came in, so at least we have that. The Game Gear is an 8-bit 4th generation handheld game console released by Sega on October 6, 1990 in Japan, and in April 1991 throughout North America and Europe. The Game Gear primarily competed with Nintendo's Game Boy, the Atari Lynx, and NEC's Turbo Express. It shares much of its hardware with the Sega Master System and can play Master System games by use of an adapter. Sega positioned the Game Gear, which had a full-color backlit screen with a landscape format, as a technologically superior handheld to the Game Boy. However, due to its short battery life, lack of original games, and weak support from Sega, the Game Gear was unable to surpass the Game Boy, selling about 11 million units when it was discontinued on October 30th, 1997. History. Developed under the name Project Mercury, the Game Gear was developed to compete with the Game Boy, which Nintendo had released in 1989. The decision to make a handheld console was made by Sega's then CEO, Hayao Nakayama, and the name was chosen by newly appointed Sega of America CEO, Michael Katz. The console had been designed as a portable version of the Master System and featured a more powerful, they say systems, but I'm gonna say more better hardware, than the Game Boy, including a full-color screen in contrast to the monochromatic, at the time pea soup green, of the Game Boy. According to former console hardware research and development head Hideki Sato, Sega saw the Game Boy's black and white screen as a challenge to make our own color handheld system. To improve upon the design of their competition, Sega modeled the Game Gear with a similar shape to a Genesis controller, with the idea being that the curved surfaces and longer length would make the Game Gear more comfortable to hold than the Game Boy. The console's mass was carefully considered, aiming for a total mass between that of the Game Boy and the Atari Lynx, another full-color screen competing product. Yeah, Atari Lynx came out in September 1989, and it was, quote, hybrid 8-bit, 16-bit. Whatever that means. So why was Sega competing with the Game Boy? Why weren't they viewing the Atari Lynx as a rival? Because it was the 90s, and just the 90s did not care about what Atari did. That's that. Despite the similarities between the Game Gear and the Master System, the games of the latter, Master System, were not directly playable on the Game Gear, and were only able to be played on the handheld by use of an accessory called the Master Gear, which I accidentally bought around 94. I had no idea what a Master System was. The packaging was really shoddy, like it had been bought and returned 20 times. I think I found it on the floor at Toys R Us. I thought it was some hidden gem that cost under $30 and would basically turn the Game Gear into a Nomad, which didn't exist yet. Genesis cards fit in it, but when you turn it on, nothing happened. I don't know, I was 10. I still thought computers were microscopic magic in cool plastic cases. But anyways, the original Game Gear packing game was Columns, which was similar to the Tetris cartridge that Nintendo had included when it launched the Game Boy. It fits the form factor well. I would have enjoyed having Columns, but my packing game was Sonic 2, which was meh for a Sonic game. With a late start into the handheld gaming market, Sega rushed to get the Game Gear into stores quickly, having lagged behind Nintendo in sales without a handheld on the market. As one method of doing so, Sega based the hardware of the Game Gear on the Master System, albeit with a much larger color palette than its predecessor. The Game Gear supported 4,096 colors compared to the 64 colors supported by the Master System. More colors, but the Game Gear screen is way more inferior to a television screen. And the other way around, given the choice, and I'm using emulation, not original hardware, I will near always choose the Master System version of a game that's on Game Gear, because Game Gear games are cropped to fit on the smaller screen. There are patches for games like GG Shinobi that let you play it on Master System with the wider view of the game, and I don't know why, but the Sonic 1 sprite looks better on Master System. His face is all squished on the Game Gear version. But despite that, it was very popular when it launched in Japan, and Who cares about the numbers? Game Gear only released with 3 games. Columns, which is different from Tetris. Maybe how you would say checkers and chess are different. They're in the same genre. They look similar from a distance, but the mechanics are different. So for me, Columns is a win. There's also Pengo, which I had for the Atari 800. It was in the arcades in 1982. It's fun, but it's very 80s. They didn't do a lot to update it. By the 90s, we were looking to leave behind everything from the 80s. That's why Metallica had to reinvent itself. That's why Mario had to reinvent himself. And third was Super Monaco GP. It was already out in the Genesis. By the way, Columns was also out in the Genesis first. Release and marketing. Before the Game Gear's launch in 1990, Sega had success marketing its 16-bit home console, the Sega Genesis, by advertising it as a more mature option for gamers. In keeping with this approach, Sega positioned the Game Gear as a grown-up option compared to the Game Boy, which, keep in mind, was 1991 and still before Sonic the Hedgehog. While Sega's marketing in Japan did not take this perspective, instead opting for advertisements with Japanese women featuring the Handheld. Sega's worldwide advertising prominently positioned the Game Gear as the cooler console to the Game Boy. In North America, marketing for the Game Gear included side-by-side comparisons of Sega's new Handheld with the Game Boy, and likened Game Boy players to the obese and uneducated. Most of those commercials featured the Sega Scream, which showed a person yelling the logo. Sega! Yeah, I didn't know that until now. The Sonic 1 Sega! Was used for their Japan advertisements at the time. Sega! One Sega advertisement in early 1994 featured the quote, "If you were colorblind and had an IQ of less than 12, then you wouldn't mind which portable you had." Such advertising drew outrage from Nintendo, who sought to have protests organized against Sega for insulting disabled persons. Sega responded with a statement from Sega of America President Tom Kalinske saying that Nintendo should spend more time improving their products and marketing rather than working on behind-the-scenes coercive activities. Also, that ad prominently featured a dog, tame compared to some of their more extreme 90s ads. Ultimately, this debate would have little impact on sales for the Game Gear, because it didn't sell that much. Decline. Support for the Game Gear by Sega was hurt by its primary focus on its home console systems. In addition to the success of the Genesis, Sega was also supporting 2 peripherals for its home system, the Sega CD and 32X, as well as developing a new 32-bit system, the Sega Saturn. Despite selling about 11 million units, the Game Gear was never able to match the success of its main rival, the Game Boy, which sold over 10 times that number. I was doing the math on it, looking at supposed sales of the Game Gear, and the numbers didn't add up. So if I figured it out, Game Gear units sold by 1997, Game Boy units sold. And if I didn't figure it out, still, I'll just put what 10 times 11 million is. The system's late sales were further hurt by Nintendo's release of the Game Boy Pocket, a smaller version of the Game Boy, which could run on 2 AAA batteries. First off, compared to my Genesis, a life-changing piece of hardware that blew my mind at the time, the Game Gear was meh. It made car rides bearable. It was a tool for combating boredom, because when you're a kid, you don't have a lot of control when it comes to having to go places, so having a thing you can bring with you is valuable, and anytime someone brought a Game Boy or Game Gear into school, it was memorable. I still remember playing Sonic 1 in a classroom. How did that happen? I remember playing Game Boy, Mega Man on the bus. I remember playing Gigi Shinobi and Nathan Banks' mom's Volvo. But I don't have a lot of memories about my own Game Gear. It wasn't a system to own, it was a system to share, or something like that. Plans for a 16-bit successor to the Game Gear were made to bring Sega's handheld gaming into the 5th generation of video games, but a new handheld system never materialized for Sega, leaving only the Genesis Nomad, a portable version of the Genesis to take its place, which came out in October '95, kinda late. Moreover, the Nomad was intended to supplement the Game Gear rather than replace it. In press coverage leading up to the Nomad's release, Sega representatives said the company was not dropping support for the Game Gear in favor of the Nomad, and that "we believe the two can coexist." Though the Nomad had been released in 1995, Sega did not officially end support for the Game Gear until 1996 in Japan and 1997 worldwide. They were stretched too thin, and as it turns out, there was a big disconnect between Sega of America and Japan. They seemed to compete with Nintendo and themselves. The Game Gear needed a screen upgrade or to be more power efficient, more than the Genesis needed the 32X. And if the Nomad didn't win people over, then the Game Gear successor definitely would have flopped. Technical specifications. The console contains an 8-bit 3.5 MHz g-loc Z80 chip for a CPU, the same as the Master System. Its screen measures 3.2 inches on the diagonal and is able to display up to 32 colors at a time from a total palette of 4,096 colors with a frame rate of this many hertz. In casual speak, you would just say 60 hertz. With a display resolution of 1,160 by 144 non-square pixels. The screen is backlit in order to allow players to game in low lighting situations. Powered by 6 AA batteries, the Game Gear has an approximate battery life of 3 to 5 hours. In order to lengthen this duration and to save money for consumers, Sega also released 2 types of external rechargeable battery packs for the Game Gear. I am certain I was using rechargeable NiCads by the time I got a Game Gear. The system contains 8 kilobytes of RAM and an additional 16 kilobytes of video RAM. It produces sound using a Texas Instruments SN76489 PSG, which is also used in the Master System. However, unlike the Master System, stereo sound is able to be supplied through an output for the headphones. Several accessories were created for the Game Gear during its lifespan. A TV tuner accessory with a whip antenna plugs into the system's cartridge slot, allowing viewing of analog television stations over the air on the Game Gear screen. It was about $100, and while I thought it was cool, I don't think I ever saw one in real life, and I knew how limited it would be to get signal in a rural location. Another accessory, the Super Wide Gear, magnifies the Game Gear screen to compensate for its relatively small size. Meh. Kind of silly, but interesting that it was a thing. I was gonna say, you don't see things like that for the Nintendo Switch, but of course there are third-party screen magnifiers, but Nintendo would never make one today. Also released was the Car Gear adapter that plugs into the, at the time, universally included cigarette lighter port to power the system while traveling, and the gear-to-gear cable that establishes a data connection between 2 Game Gear systems using the same multiplayer game and let users play against each other. Cool in theory, but I never saw one out in the wild, and I didn't have any multiplayer games, and it originally cost only $15. I'm sure it was at Toys R Us, but parents of the 90s saw little add-ons as lychee scams. Also, the Master Gear converter enables the Game Gear to play Master System games. Yes, we know. Game library. Over 300 games were released for the Game Gear, although at the time of the console's launch, there were only 6 software games available. Remember, 3 in Japan, but in the US 6 months later, there was also Castle Evolution starring Mickey Mouse, g-loc Air Battle, Psychic World, and Revenge of Drancon. Prices for game cartridges initially ranged from $25 to $30 each. Now's a good time as any to mention that the Game Gear was originally $150 in North America. I think it was $120 by the time I got it in '94. And Game Boy was $90 at launch, by the way. A large part of the Game Gear's library consists of Master System ports. Because of the landscape orientation of the Game Gear's screen and similarities in hardware between the handheld console and the Master System, it was easy for developers to port Master System games to the Game Gear. Because of Nintendo's control over the video game market, few third-party developers were available to create games for Sega's system. Likewise, because of this, the Game Gear's library contained many games that were not available on other handhelds, pulling sales away from the Atari Lynx and NEC Turbo Express and helping to establish the Game Gear's position in the market. I may have been aware of the Atari Lynx, but it's hard to convey how quickly things from the 80s got obsoleted into the 90s, especially brands like Atari that were already starting to fall apart. That was the lesson. If you show weakness, you're out of here. And I didn't know what a Turbo Express was. I played TurboGrafx at Toys R Us, one of the bonk games. It was like a curious oddity to me, but I didn't know anyone with a TurboGrafx. I never saw ads for it, so it was never a thing I wanted. Well, the Game Gear's library consisted of over 300 games. However, the Game Boy's library contained over 1,000 individual games. Game Gear Micro. On June 3rd, 2020, as part of their 60th anniversary, Sega revealed the Game Gear Micro Retro Console. The Micro was released in Japan on October 6, 2020 through Japanese storefronts in 4 different versions, varying in color and game selection, with each containing 4 separate Game Gear games. So the games are built into it. Each unit otherwise is the same size and is powered by 2 AAA batteries or through a separate USB charger. Each unit also includes a headphone jack, a magnifying accessory modeled after the original system's big window accessory actually exists. So what do you know? Nintendo won't do it, but Sega will. Also, this thing is impractically tiny, so why start making practical decisions? Reception. The Game Gear surpassed the Atari Lynx and NEC Turbo Express, but lagged far beyond the Game Boy behind the Game Boy in the handheld marketplace. Retrospective reception of the Game Gear is mixed. In 2008, GamePro listed the Game Gear as the 10th on their list of 10 worst selling handhelds of all time, and criticized aspects of the implementation of its technology, but also stated that the Game Gear could be considered a success for having nearly 11 million units sold. Hideki Sato stated that the Game Gear did take a significant piece of the handheld console market share, but that Nintendo's Game Boy was such a runaway success that it had gobbled up so much of the market that our success was still seen as a failure, which I think is a shame. I'm just going to summarize everything from my point of view, and I'm being North America specific, so all these numbers are North America specific. In the long run, Nintendo won. Sega stopped making hardware, so of course Nintendo would go on to make mobile gaming consoles that make the Game Gear look like a footnote. But in the early 90s, Nintendo won handhelds because of its brand and price point. They made it cheap enough so more people could buy it at a time when kids were still content to play these Tiger LCD handhelds. This isn't even Tiger, this is MGA, Microgames of America. Nintendo had a lot more developers locked into its ecosystem, and Sega was still the underdog. Genesis was released over 2 years before the Super Nintendo, so it had a head start to compete for the TV. But Game Boy was released in September 1989, so it had a year and a half head start on the Game Gear. Plus, Sonic wouldn't debut on the Genesis till June 1991, and the Game Gear till December 28, 1991, after Christmas. But Super Mario Land came out July 31st, 1989, with plenty of time for the holiday hype. Plus, they had Tetris. Everyone played Tetris. But not everyone played columns. I came into things when Sonic was an established brand leader, and I played the Genesis way before I played a Super Nintendo. Plus, NES was a more expensive console versus Genesis. So price-wise, Genesis was more available like the Game Boy. I liked the form factor of the Game Gear more, but I didn't love my Game Gear like I did my Genesis. It just wasn't as fulfilling a purchase. The tech wasn't quite there. It reached a little too far where Game Boy was content to keep it simple, but in its time period, it was second place at the beginning of a new market. And that's the end. The Game Gear primarily competed with the... This is great. This is what happens when you record in your basement. Ugh. Just wait for that.